Good evening, and thank you for being here with us tonight. During the March Madness, Michigan State is beating Delaware, by the way, 83-67. Didn't somebody predict that they would win it all? I'm Joe Grady. I'm Senior Fellow for Public Policy at the Pell Center, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you all on behalf of the Pell Center. The Pell Center is a policy think tank based here at Salve Regina University. Most of you may be familiar with us. For those of you who are not, we're a policy think tank focusing on both national and local and regional and international policy, with a special focus on getting the word out about policy and the issues that face us as a society through forums like this one and through publications. So we want to thank you very much for coming and participating, and we hope you will stick around after the presentations for a lively discussion. The discussions, I'm going to turn it over to Pell Center Fellow Carolyn Deedy, and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Joe. And again, welcome. It's great to have you here. I'm particularly delighted to see students here with March Madness going on and a nice spring day and a Thursday night, which is usually a very social night. I appreciate you taking the time to come and enjoy what I am certain will be an enlightening and interesting and lively discussion. Incarceration nation. That's us. That's the United States of America. About 1 out of every 100 Americans is in prison. About 1 out of every 40 children has a parent in prison in the United States. No country imprisons more of its citizens than the United States. Not a single one. The number is currently around 2 million, and this is despite a steady decline in the crime rate over the past 2 decades. If crime is down, now to be fair, the incarceration rate has gone down a bit over the past few years, but still higher than any other country. If crime is down, why are there still so many Americans in prison? That's what we're here to discuss tonight. People have speculated, experts have speculated that it could be from harsher mandatory sentences, particularly drug sentencing, which stemmed from the decades-long war on drugs, which started actually under President Nixon, so that long ago. They also point to the fact that the United States has a politicized criminal justice system, and the lack of a social safety net, in other words, sort of reentry programs and support for when prisoners get out of prison. And another aspect that does seem to affect the incarceration rates is recidivism. Over 50% of prisoners will reoffend and be reincarcerated within 3 years of their release. And that number is quite high, as you can imagine. So that's what we are here to talk about tonight. Why are there so many Americans in prison? It costs $80 billion a year to keep these people in prison. We have a very distinguished panel, and I'm particularly excited because our panelists offer perspectives from different aspects of the criminal justice system: legal, the prison system, probation. So you're going to get very interesting points of view. And after each speaker has talked, we will have the Q&A session, and we really look forward to your questions and comments. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. He is a professor at Roger Williams School of Law, currently on leave, and he's working for the Office of Enforcement at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission as an attorney/investigator and also training coordinator. We're very pleased to have him because he made the trip up from Washington, D.C. to be with us. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor David Zlotnick.
Thank you. So first, thank you to the Pell Center. It's really a privilege and an honor to be here. I've been asked to talk about over-incarceration and sentencing, and I want to start really with a phone call that I received this morning, and it's a phone call that I've gotten probably almost once a week for the last 5 or 6 years from an individual named Scott Walker, who is serving life without parole for drug conspiracy in the federal system. And his story, it really illustrates or typifies many of the problems that are wrong with our criminal justice system, and particularly with the federal criminal justice system. So just a minute or two about this 39-year-old individual who I've gotten to know quite well over the last decade. As many people who enter the criminal justice system, he had a troubled childhood. His abusive father died young. He did not get along well with his stepfather at the time, although now they're quite close. And so he turned to drugs, mostly smoking marijuana, which then turned to methamphetamine use. And he didn't finish high school. He started bouncing back between family homes in Arizona and southern Illinois. And he realized he could get drugs a lot cheaper in Arizona than he could in Illinois. And so initially, to sort of feed his own drug use, he started bringing drugs back and forth. He was very good at this. He was a musician, a very talented, very friendly guy. Everyone likes him. He's had no problems in prison. And that turned out to be really quite a good profile for a nonviolent drug offender. Very well liked, and he knew his drugs. He also hooked up with a gentleman who was 20 years older than him with 2 prior felon drug records, drug offenses, and that rapidly expanded their network. They were bringing methamphetamine, marijuana, LSD, cocaine, but he was by no means a kingpin, and by no means was he the head of the organization. He had some early brushes with the criminal justice system, drug possession, trespassing, that was really a minor burglary. He was never sent to prison. He got probation, he spent a couple of nights in jail, and honestly, he'll tell you now that kind of emboldened him because they were just slaps on the wrist. Eventually, the ring got large enough that it attracted the attention of a joint state and federal task force, which then arrested everyone. And that's when things started to go very wrong for Scott, because he showed loyalty to his friends, which I think he now recognizes was misguided. The kingpin, with 2 prior drug felonies, who was the head, immediately cooperated and agreed to testify against everyone. Scott wouldn't testify against his friends, went to trial, and lost. All his friends, or alleged friends, then came to court as cooperating witnesses and inflated the drug amounts and his role in the offense. He got what's called the trial penalty for going for trial, and he ended up with a mandatory life without parole sentence. His judge, a very conservative Republican appointee, was appalled by what he had to do, and he has since written a beautiful letter in support of Scott's commutation, in which he writes, "Scott's hopefulness in the face of a life sentence is a tribute to the human spirit." And I talk to this fellow, like I said, almost every week, and he never complains, and he talks about the programs he's in and his hopes for the future, and his connection with his daughter, who he had not really gotten to know as she grew up, and his plans for the future when he gets out. And whatever petty annoyances are happening in my life, I realize they are in fact petty annoyances, because he wakes up every morning knowing he'll spend his life in prison. He will not get out, because there is no what we call back-end parole, and I'm sure the other speakers will talk about the previous parole, or the parole system. In the federal system, he will have to serve every day of his life in prison unless and until the President of the United States commutes his sentence. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about a couple of these issues, but I think I want you to recognize that this incarceration issue is more than a criminal justice issue. It's a sociological issue and a political issue. That is, in this country, we have decided to use the criminal justice system to address certain social problems for which the criminal justice system is not well addressed. And I think I'll just start with 3, although there are more. The first is drug use and drug addiction, which are actually different things. The second is mental health issues, which in fact are sometimes related to drug issues because people self-medicate. And the third, and most controversial, is what I would call the race and poverty issue. That is, in this country, when we are frightened of or suspicious or uncomfortable with immigrants, with disadvantaged minorities, we choose to attack the problems in those communities, often with the criminal justice system and incarceration, rather than other approaches. So, for example, The crack cocaine problem, which is when I was a federal prosecutor in Washington, was horrific. It ravaged the African American community in D.C. But the sole reaction of the government was to ratchet up crimes and put every street corner crack dealer in jail for as long as they possibly could, rather than think about other reasons that these young men were gathering on street corners to sell $5 and $10 worth of crack to their neighbors. So how do we get there and what do we talk about? I think I want to give you just 2 minutes on what I would call the politicization or the over-criminalization in America. 2 minutes of history. Back in England, the system we adopted, there were not a lot of crimes, and there were not a lot of punishments. If you stole a horse, if you killed someone, if you committed rape, one punishment, hanging from the nearest tree. Okay? That was seen as overly harsh over time, and so we invented prisons. And once we invented prisons, we started multiplying the number of crimes. And what has happened in this country in the modern era, really since the 1970s, is every time that there is some crime of notoriety or a crime wave of some time, the reaction of politicians is to increase sentences and make them mandatory minimums. It actually dates to the 1920s. Can anyone think about what that crime that was? Bonnie and Clyde, bank robbery. Bank robbery was made a federal crime. But really the modern era starts with the war on crime by President Nixon and the first wave of mandatory minimums. So mandatory minimums are a set penalty for a set crime. In the drug arena, it's generally a set amount of drugs, gets you so much time. No exceptions unless you cooperate. And now a few more others around the edges. What's interesting and important to recognize is that over penalization of drugs and mandatory minimums are cyclical. The mandatory minimums of the 1970s were repealed because they were found not to be effective. But after the crack cocaine explosion in the 1980s, Len Bias, for those of you who are old enough to remember, it's NCAA time, and he was a great University of Maryland star who died of, they thought a crack cocaine overdose, was actually freebasing, but that's getting a little too into the weeds. In any event, Congress decided to ratchet up the penalties for crack cocaine so that two sugar packets, $100, $150 worth of crack got you 5 years without parole. What I think is important is also to understand that there are sort of theories of punishment that underlie the cycles of ratcheting up penalties and then pulling back. And this is sort of classic criminal law 101. The 4 theories of punishment are retribution. So someone must pay for their crime. It's a moral theory. You've done something wrong, you should pay for it. And there's a sense of proportionality, with murder being the worst and jaywalking down at the other end. Incapacitation is the second. That is, this person is so dangerous that we must remove them from society for as long as necessary to keep them from harming others. The third is deterrence, of which there are 2 kinds: specific, which is how long do I have to put you in prison or you in prison so that you won't do that again. I've talked to many, many drug offenders as an academic, and it's really interesting. They will often tell me a year wouldn't have been enough, maybe not 2. But by the 5th or 7th year, they realize they've missed their grandmother's funeral, the first day of kindergarten for their child, and they realize the life they were living was not worth it. Okay, and that's from their own mouths about how long, for the really sort of hardened street, heroin or meth dealer or crack dealer, they felt they needed to be off the street before they really realized that they would happily take a working job at minimum wage as opposed to the life they've been living. And then there is general deterrence, which is how much time do I have to put someone in prison to scare everybody else into not doing it. And finally, rehabilitation. That is, how long do we have to keep you in prison so that you can fix yourself or have us fix you so you won't do it again? And about 20, 30 years ago, well, actually for most of the 20th century, rehabilitation dominated the American criminal justice scene. There was a sense that we could, with prison programs, reform people. But about late 1970s, 80s, by the 90s, there was a frustration with this. And in 1984, the Sentencing Reform Act was passed that abolished in the federal system parole and abolished the idea of rehabilitation and decided that retribution, and incapacitation and deterrence would be the only reasons to lock people up. And that changed things in very dramatic ways. The first is it gave enormous power to prosecutors because they decided whether to charge a mandatory minimum or not, and it took the powers away from the judges. And what happened as a result was that there was an unholy alliance between the legislatures and the prosecutors. Each one of them benefited from more mandatory minimums and more crimes, because the politicians could say, I'm tough on crime, and the prosecutors had complete power, and judges could no longer say to them, now that's too much for that guy. And so judges were taken out of the equation, and prosecutors and legislators pretty much ruled the roost. The other thing that then ended up happening is the development of what some call the prison industrial complex, primarily private prisons, more than state prisons, in which there became an incentive for both politicians and industry to say to rural communities that were having economic problems, oh, we'll put a private prison here, provides jobs, construction, and then the prison guards and other people working in the system now have a vested interest in seeing that the system continue. Now, with that all being said, things are in fact slowly starting to change, particularly at the state level. Initially, we saw even the most conservative legislators realizing they were bankrupting the state by incarcerating folks. And as I said, we talk about the front end, and that's what I've been talking about, the laws and the prosecution, what puts people there. The back end is what do we do once they're in there. There's a recognition that having our prisons be turned into nursing homes is neither protecting public safety nor particularly a good use of state funds. And so states like Michigan that had what was called the 650 lifer law, 650 grams of crack got you life in prison without parole. Not crack, just powder. That law was finally repealed a couple of years ago when even the most avid proponents of the law initially realized that it was backfiring and was incarcerating too many people for too long who might be rehabilitated, who might be willing to make a contribution to society, and they simply couldn't afford it. There's also a recognition at the federal level now, and we've seen some very recent commutations by President Obama, who, by the way, was the stingiest president in history in commuting sentences. He finally commuted the sentences of 6 individuals who were serving crack cocaine sentences that were no longer the law. That is, Congress had sort of dialed back the crack sentences, yet they were still paying for under the original sentencing guidelines and prison sentences. And there's now been a call for more commutations and also for a rollback of some of the stricter sentences. I think from at least my perspective, although I was a federal prosecutor, I've also worked for a group called Families Against Mandatory Minimums, and I've spent a good bit of time traveling around the country talking to federal judges about their views on sentencing. I believe in prison for violent offenders, both on retribution grounds and for incapacitation. Drug dealers, and I've seen this personally, destroy the quality of life in neighborhoods and are deserving of punishment. But as a defense attorney and as an academic, I think we have to recognize that there are some bedrock principles that we have moved away from in this country that I think were part of the ethos of our system, the first being proportionality. That is, there should be some agreement, and I think there is, that violent criminals and recidivist violent criminals should be punished the most severely, and that nonviolent people and first-time offenders should receive lighter sentences. I think there's also a recognition of the cost to families of having all these children grow up with parents who are incarcerated, and the collateral consequences that we burden released inmates with. There are some crazy laws out there. In Washington, D.C., you cannot be a hairdresser if you have a felony. I'm not sure if that's to do with having a pair of scissors or not. I don't know. But there are all sorts, I don't mean to make light of it, absolutely crazy restrictions that prevent people from being effectively reintegrated into society. I think the last thing I want to say before I sit down, I want to make time for my panelists and for questions, is I've also done something else. I've been in A.T. Wall's correctional facility in Rhode Island in a completely different capacity. I was trained to teach meditation to inmates. I took a course, and there's a wonderful group in Rhode Island that is a national program. They just happen to be centered here. And I have to say, sitting with folks in silence, teaching them meditation, but also learning from them, you recognize that these are human beings, and that many of them are trying to change the patterns in their lives that got them to this place. And they do need our support, they do need training, and more than anything, they need our compassion. And when people are so different than us and have had such different life patterns, it is easy to see them as other. But if you spend some time with the ones who are trying to rehabilitate themselves from the inside out, you will see that they are deserving of our respect and of our compassion. And I say that to you as a former prosecutor and as someone who is once again doing enforcement work. You can have both perspectives and still do your job, I think. So thank you, and I turn the panel over to the rest.
Thank you very much, Professor Zlotnick. Our next speaker, I'm very pleased to introduce, and some of you may be familiar with him. Rhode Island actually is cited and is looked to as an example of progress, I suppose, is what you would say, with corrections and the criminal justice system. And with us tonight, we have the director of the Rhode Island Department of Corrections. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome A.T. Wall.
Thank you, Carolyn. It is an honor for me to be here. I am a public official. You pay my salary, and I think I need to be accountable to you, and am pleased to have this opportunity to not only speak with you for a little while, but also to hear from you as well. First, the name. It's actually Ashbel T. Wall II. A story too long to tell in the time allotted to us here. Suffice it to say that everyone calls me AT, including my own parents, who gave me the name. By the way, their names are John and Mary. I am the director of the Rhode Island Department of Corrections. Got my start in the field as a line probation and parole officer. You'll hear more about that work from Scott. And now I am very proud to be in my 15th year as director of our department here. Just a quick overview of the Rhode Island Department of Corrections. We are a full-service adult correctional agency. The jails, which in many states are county functions, so the awaiting trial population and people serving short sentences are part of our department's responsibility. The prisons, probation, and parole supervision as well. And our reach is actually quite vast. We have about 17,000 admissions into our institutions every year. And on any given day, we have another 23,000 people on the streets of Rhode Island. We have a system in which split sentencing is the norm. The courts will say 10 years, 6 to serve at the adult correctional institutions, and the following 4 to be served in the community under supervised release. And what the courts have basically done here is trade off relatively low rates of incarceration per se against very long terms of post-release supervision. So the irony is that while we are one of the states in the bottom rungs of incarceration rates, we are actually very near the top when it comes to overall rates of correctional control. And in some senses, what we have, and David alluded to it, is a sort of pay me later approach. Because those people who are out there on supervision for years and years will at some point, in many cases, violate, not only through new crimes, but through not notifying their probation officer of their whereabouts, for failing a drug test and so forth, and they cycle back into the system. So one of the final statistic that I'll give you is that our reach is actually quite vast. On any given day, 1 out of every 21 men in Rhode Island is under our department's thumb. And as you can imagine, that's concentrated in certain urban areas in particular. I'm a native of Providence, and I live there still. In Providence, it's 1 out of every 11. In Woonsocket, it's about 1 out of every 12. Central Falls, 1 out of every 10. Newport's doing better. That's more like 1 out of every 18 or so. In any event, some ruminations, and that's really what they are, about why the incarceration rates are so high, I think nationwide, and we reflect some of it as well. And I say ruminations because I don't pretend to have scientific evidence. This is just what my reflections have told me over the course of my career. One is that I think that violence and lawlessness are in some ways in the DNA of the United States, sort of present from the beginning. I mean, the people who came to this country, at least those who were Caucasian, tended to be people who were nonconformists, rule breakers, as it would be, risk takers, willing to come a long way away from civilization, and once they got to these shores, willing to go as far west as they could to create new frontiers, and also people who just pushed the envelope. The other side of that, of course, is diversity. One of the things I've noticed is that here in the United States, the states with the lowest rates of incarceration are the most homogeneous. Take northern New England, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire. There's really not a lot of racial and ethnic diversity up there. Minnesota, North Dakota, these are the places with the lowest rates. The states with the highest rates are generally in the South and Southwest, and there diversity plays out in the subtext of race. And let's face it, many Americans were brought to America under the most violent of circumstances. And race relations in this country seem to be interwoven with crime, fear of crime, commission of crime. And I think we need to acknowledge the role of race in diversity. One of the things I notice is that in Europe, where governments have criticized the United States for its high incarceration rates, those incarceration rates are rising. My sense is because Europe is no longer simply sort of a white continent. People emigrating from the former colonies, people coming from Arab countries, guest workers from poorer nations are coming in, and you're seeing that there's culture clash. And so those rates are rising elsewhere. I also think that incarceration is sort of the default option in the United States. It's interesting to compare the constitutions of other countries and that of the United States. The constitutions of many other countries talk about the right to human dignity, the presumption of freedom, very lofty ideas that also are reflected in their policies. Really, if you look at the U.S. Constitution, the only place where there's a direct intersection is the Eighth Amendment. Punishment is not to be cruel and unusual. But other than that, there's really nothing said. So I also think that it has to do with a very different perspective. And then bringing it down to the more kind of local level, certainly what I've seen is that, again, here in our state, one of the issues tends to be what I said, that these long terms of supervision are traded off against short terms of incarceration, but it eventually catches up. The reality is that our reintegration of offenders is not, well, the outcomes aren't particularly good, let's put it that way. Our prisons are highly structured. They do not promote independence of thought. They do not promote self-actualization. Basically, we make the rules. We determine really what your schedule is going to be in every respect, what the rhythm of your life will be. We're not much interested in autonomy. We're interested in making sure the place is safe, secure, and orderly. And that means we're pretty authoritarian. Well, of course, that works fine if you're running an institution, but when somebody is released from that highly structured setting and sort of life comes at them from all angles, they're not particularly well prepared. 1 out of every 3 people released from sentences at the ACI is back in our custody under new sentences within 12 months. If you look at the people who are back, not necessarily sentenced, but awaiting trial, that's about 46% within 12 months. There's a tremendous amount of churning. What I can say, things are up close and personal in Rhode Island, and I'm in our institutions frequently, and sometimes I'm there when people are being released, and they will say to me, "Director, you will not see me again here at the ACI. I have learned my lesson. I understand now. I want to go straight." And if we administered a lie detector test to them at that moment, they would most of them would pass. They really in their hearts believe. They're full of high hopes and great expectations and convinced that it will be different this time. But the fact of the matter is the spirit may be willing, the flesh is weak, and it's hard out there. And they do come back. They do reoffend. So that's another reason our rates remain high, is people just keep cycling through. And finally, there is a feature that I would say is there's something, I mean, my experience is that when people talk about corrections, and particularly crime committed by people who will either be released from, are released from, or headed to corrections, we in the profession, we try to convince people, we try to make arguments as to why it's important to give people the opportunity to succeed in the community. We try to appeal to the rational. But really the predominant reactions, the emotions to corrections are fear and anger. And what we find is that there is virtually no tolerance for risk. And a lot of correctional policy is driven by the notorious exception. Many people are released. Many of them commit crimes. Many don't. But every once in a while you get someone who commits the really high-profile, really abhorrent crime, and things spin completely out of control. I mean, the so-called 3 strikes, are any of you familiar with the 3 strikes legislation? That was driven by a horrible case. Somebody who had been released from prison, who kidnapped a girl in California from her own slumber party, sexually assaulted her and murdered her. And that led to thousands of people being incarcerated for very long terms until the law was modified recently. So I think we have to accept those realities too. Politics enters the equation. When the public is aroused, politicians want to capitalize on it. No one wants to be on the wrong side of that equation. So what you've ended up with ever since the Clinton years is a standoff. No one is going to let the other one neither party is going to let the other party outflank them. And so they end up in this bidding war against each other, and that keeps rates up as well. So those are some thoughts. Would love to hear yours when the time comes. And again, thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Director Wall. Our next speaker is a probation officer at the Massachusetts Trial Court District Court Division in Fall River. He also is involved in an initiative, a new initiative in the state, which he can talk about. And this is someone who works every day. He is working with prisoners or ex-prisoners one-on-one. And I think will offer an interesting perspective as well. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Scott Fichera.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thanks to the Pell Center for having me. One thing I want to apologize for right off, I grew up in Massachusetts, right around Boston, so if you hear my accent come out, I apologize. It usually does. I try not to, but...
We can translate.
As Carolyn said, my name is Scott Fichera. I work as a probation officer for the Massachusetts Trial Court. I am in the District Court Division. Right now I'm in Fall River. In Massachusetts, just by way of background, there are two main adult trial court divisions, District Court and Superior Court. District Court deals with crimes where the punishment is up to 2.5 years in jail. Any crime that is punishable by more than that goes up to Superior Court. Superior Court offenses are usually, they serve their time through the state prisons. The District Court crimes serve their time at the House of Corrections, which is it's a county-run facility. Where I am in District Court, when I sentence somebody to jail, it's to the House of Corrections. So that's what I know about. A couple of things that I wanted to look at is recidivism, why people reoffend, and what are we doing to help people not reoffend. I think it's important to note that a very small number of the community commits a majority of the crimes. The people are offending, reoffending, and reoffending. And these same people are going to jail, coming out, going back to jail, coming out, and going back to jail. And how do we stop this? Well, in Massachusetts, we've turned to a risk assessment program developed out of the University of Cincinnati. We call it the ORAS, which stands for the Ohio Risk Assessment System. And what we're trying to do is, well, first I should say that they've developed 35 items that are statistically validated that are predictive of offending. And some of these are obvious. Someone's criminal background, the neighborhood they live in, drug use, parents, if they grew up in a criminally involved household with their parents. But some of them were actually shocking to me, and I had never thought of them before. And I'd just like to bring a couple of those up. Someone's time that isn't structured, if they don't have a structured daily life, if they're not engaged in pro-social activities, they're engaged in anti-social activities, hanging out with friends who are criminally involved. That's a predictive of offending. Criminal friends, gang membership, someone's propensity to tell a lie is predictive of offending. Someone's propensity to engage in a fight, a physical altercation, is predictive of offending. And actually, there's one item which I found fascinating, is that we asked them, do you believe in this statement? Do unto others before they do unto you. Someone who agrees with that statement, they have found more likely to reoffend. And what we do is we go through this assessment system. We ask the 35 questions and assign a numerical value to that system. And the higher the score, the more supervision they get. Now, I'm not sure if you're familiar with probation, but usually what happens is you go to court, you're charged with an offense, your lawyer and the prosecutor, 80% of the time, they get together, they look at the police report, they look at your criminal history, and they try and fashion a sentence that is punitive. So you may have a 2-year suspended sentence where you have 2 years hanging over your head. If you get in trouble, you go to jail for 2 years. They also try to attach programming to try and fix that behavior. So if someone is before the court on a domestic assault and battery, a lot of times they will order you to go to batterers counseling to try and fix that situation. Now that's done in a 5-minute span in a crowded courtroom by 2 people that don't know much about the offender's history, what they've gone through in the past, and they're trying to come up with a way to not have this person reoffend. What we're trying to do is identify those offenders who are high risk through this risk assessment system and supervise those offenders that need supervision. And one of the unintended consequences of this risk assessment system is that the University of Cincinnati discovered that there's a group of offenders who come through the criminal justice system that, now I apologize, I'm trying to get this right, that would, to left to their own devices, would not reoffend. The more we introduce them to the criminal justice system, the more they report to us, the more we send them to a program where they're sitting in a classroom with other offenders, they are more likely then to reoffend. So their rate of recidivism increases as the supervision increases. So what we're trying to do is identify those offenders who are high risk, that need supervision, but just as important is identify those offenders who are low risk, and to try and push them out of the criminal justice system because they have the strategies, they exhibit the pro-social values, they have jobs, maybe they were just unlucky in engaging in an offense. So that's what we're trying to do. And one last thing I'd like to bring up of how we're trying to reduce recidivism is I mentioned how a prosecutor and a defense attorney come together, fashion a sentence, and it's my job to make sure they comply with whatever's brought up in court. With this system that we're using, when we ask the questions in 35 items, and what we can discover is that offenders have certain needs. They have certain things within their background that may have led to their offending. And those needs may not have been addressed when their plea was fashioned in court. They may live in a really bad neighborhood. They may hang out with a really bad group of people. They may have absolutely no positive social support system in place. Those issues are not addressed in court. And what we try and do is identify those, and we work in conjunction with the offender to try and change those behaviors. We use what's called a PICA. We call it PICA. It's a Probation Individual Change Agreement. It has nothing to do with the conditions of probation. It's a form that we sit down and we identify together problems within the probationer's life. So let's just say, for example, a bad neighborhood, and we come up with a specific plan to try and fix that problem. And we make it it's smart, specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. We work with them to, we'll say, okay, your next appointment with me, I want you to look around the area and find three places that you would like to live that you deem to be a safe neighborhood. They bring it in, we go over it. And they'll say, okay, next time you come in, I want you to find 5 available apartments in those neighborhoods that you would like to live in. And they bring in that information. And what we're trying to do is to empower them to acknowledge, A, my offending may have something to do with where I live, and B, remove myself from that situation to reduce my chance at reoffending. And that's what we're trying to do on a probation level, a local level, and that's what we're trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fichera. Please, now, we would love to hear from you. If you have any questions or comments, we would like to hear them. Before Teresa and Gabby bring the microphones around, I actually had a question for the panel. The Pell Center recently released a study on incarceration and recidivism and looked at other countries. Now, sometimes it's apples and oranges when you're trying to compare the United States with another country because it's been discussed. Our society is different. It's much more diverse than some other countries, particularly the countries that have the lowest incarceration rates, the lowest incidences of recidivism. And those are the Scandinavian countries, which tend to be a little more homogeneous. So you can't make a direct comparison because there are just different factors at play. However, there is a different mindset, if you will. So this is a question sort of looking at the large picture and about society. In many of these countries, their approach to incarceration is, yes, sometimes punitive, but also rehabilitative, reform-oriented. And some of them actually spell out that what they want to do, they take it very seriously, that it's their responsibility, their government, their correctional system, it's their responsibility. Once someone is incarcerated, their job is to make them want to be a better citizen upon their release. These people who work within the system feel that they take responsibility if someone is released and is not wanting and maintaining good social skills and being a good citizen. Now, one other point to add to this is a lot of these countries that I'm thinking of and referring to in Scandinavia have much more of a social safety net simply in place in their government anyway. So my question is, or I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts on, what do you think about the, and you've touched on it, a few of you, about the mindset of Americans towards incarceration in terms of the purposes, and what is the end goal? I'm not sure if many people think about it, and I'm not sure, I think in part because a lot of us, I'm speaking for myself, I don't know anything, I have never personally been involved in the criminal justice system. I don't know anyone who's been incarcerated. So for some of us who've been removed, I think it's easy to say, lock them up, throw away the key. We don't know more about it. But as a society, what do you think our approach should be? If anyone wants to comment.
Sure. You know, there's so much that I could say to that. I do think that comparisons with homogeneous countries are just not that productive. I think when we talk about diversity in this country, we have to be more specific, as I said, which is talk about the fact that we have, to some extent, a permanent underclass, and to some extent that underclass has been racialized, and that breeds isolation, and therefore hostility both from the community towards the police and the criminal justice system, and suspicion and fear of that underclass by the majority, and therefore a willingness to dump whatever their problems are into the criminal justice system. I do agree that our culture has, I believe, a more punitive ethos, a more retributive. I think the only thing I disagree with what AT said is I don't think we have a more violent culture anymore. I think most Americans are kind of like Western Europeans in that we don't normally resort to violence, but what we do have is an attachment to what I call our cowboy culture roots, and the product of that is a resistance to regulating guns. And so the prevalence of guns in our inner cities and in our suburbs have led to a lot more serious violence, because things that would normally be settled with fists or knives are settled with firearms, which result in much more violent crime. I think that's a kind of a throwback. But I think honestly, although I admire what has been done in some of these countries in the prison systems, I don't think that we have the resources, because we're front loading so many thousands or millions more. You can always do more if you have more money per person. But we're warehousing people now, and we don't have the resources, and we're sending people back into the very communities in which they grew up hopeless, isolated, and angry, and so there's a less that can be done. Now, the more we do for reentry, and I'm a huge fan of reentry programs, and I think many prisoners are too. I mean, I've talked to people who've been in prison for 15 or 20 years, and they don't know how to use the internet, although finally in the federal system, I now get emails. You know, it's pretty cool to get an email from the Federal Correctional Institute. They're now allowing them a little bit, but their inability to function, as AT said, once you're in a very authoritarian or rigid system, to come out, it scares them. I mean, that great scene from The Shawshank Redemption of the guy that hangs himself a few days after being released because he couldn't handle freedom is something that is quite telling. I don't know if that's just rambling or if that answers your question, so let me turn it over to the rest of the panel.
Carolyn, if I understand your question, it was really sort of what do we think the public expects of the correctional system?
That, yes, and would a shift in mindset help? Would it reduce the incarceration and recidivism rate? And also, if we were a society that had more of the social safety net programs in place, do you think that would make a difference as well?
First, as to what is expected of us, I do point out to groups when I'm with them that we are the correctional system that you designed. In other words, we are the product of the democratic republic that is the United States. The legislature, our representatives, are the ones who are the architects of this system, and the judges are the ones who either enforce it or overturn it. And it does lead to a certain schizophrenia on the part of the public. I think the expectation is that we will be both the punishment and the cure. And that's a pretty difficult balance for us to strike. But that I sense is what's wanted from us. I also think, in terms of what else you were asking, Carolyn, that there's no question in our minds, in the profession, that what we seek to do is to use incarceration as an opportunity to get the attention of those who are willing to. There's somewhere on that sort of continuum of change where they're willing to start working on the things that brought them there in the first place, and to be there to provide the supports that are needed. One of the difficulties for us is, again, the question of risk. And Scott was talking about risk assessment, and we know that ultimately risk of predicting human behavior can be structured, but there's always an element of uncertainty, and our experience is, once again, there's zero public tolerance for the case that really goes off the rails. And that constrains us in particular ways. The idea of reintegration, I think, really is essential. I think that we send ticking time bombs out there when we release people without having provided them with opportunities in prison or supports when they're outside. And what I say about prisoner reentry is really there's nothing sentimental about it. Yes, we enjoy those stories of people who have made profound changes in their lives, and we like redemption, and we celebrate those people who have reformed. But it's really not sentimental. It's a cold, hard calculation. The people who have come through our doors are people who have the demonstrated capacity to cause harm if certain needs aren't met. And that if we deny them those opportunities and supports, we will pay the price.
Did you want to comment?
Sure. I agree with AT in that incarceration is easy. Sending someone to jail is easy. It's an easy decision. Trying to rehabilitate somebody is hard. And trying to sell that to the public is even harder. You can rehabilitate 100 people so that they never reoffend again. That one person who you try to rehabilitate goes out and kills somebody or rapes somebody. The public is going to be clamoring, why wasn't that person in jail? They're not going to recognize the work that we're doing to rehabilitate. They're going to look at that one instance and say, we need to incarcerate. That's what's going to save us. That's what's going to save the public. We're going to put these people who have the propensity or the likelihood to offend, and we're going to protect ourselves by locking them up. And it's tough to break through that ideology.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of take a spin on one thing that AT said that is important to recognize. This is the system that democracy created, and it's a federal system. That is, we have the states and the local governments who are prosecuting 95% of the crime, and then we have the federal criminal justice system that I was part of that has a 5%. And the problem is there's a lot of irrationality and a lot of expediency built in that I think is responsible, and I alluded to this in Scott Walker's case, that there's this idea that when people commit minor offenses or even initial drug felonies, they get slapped on the wrist because A, there are too many cases, and B, everyone recognizes sending people to prison isn't necessarily a solution. But for so many of the defendants and inmates I've talked to, this initial completely slap on the wrist approach to an initial offense is enormously counterproductive because it teaches exactly the wrong lesson. And because so many of these people are short-sighted, uneducated, believe, they have very poor risk assessment, meaning, well, I got slapped on the wrist this time and I was only caught once out of 300 drug deals, I'm good, right? That when the hammer finally falls and then they get hit with the mandatory minimum, they're like, what the hell happened to me? So we need some more rationality in the front end, whether it's shock incarceration, whether it's much more efficient initial probation for the first-time offender, something that tries to catch these folks before they believe that the system's never gonna hammer them. I don't know if you thought if this is something you think would matter, either of you, but I see that as a significant problem, and federal judges in particular are so aggravated when they get someone with 2 prior drug felonies who's never served more than a week, holding, and now they have to give him 25 or 30 years.
Thank you all. Let's get some questions and comments, please, from the audience.
Okay, I have a question, two-part question, and I'm not sure, I think Director Wall probably best for you, but whatever the others want to throw in as well. I didn't hear any of you addressing the impact of gender on the incarceration rates, how that's changed historically, and the other part of it has to do with, I don't hear you addressing white-collar crime at all.
I'm sorry?
I don't hear you addressing white-collar crime like the Bernie Madoffs, the Buddy Ciancis, the people like that who are intelligent, who can reason well, but yet commit types of crimes. And what is that impact? And I know the cost is higher to incarcerate them, but I'd like to hear you all address that in terms of your statistics.
Sure. First, my take as to gender. From the mid-1980s until the early 2000s, the female offender population incarcerated in our system rose by about 400%. And I think that there are some reasons. One, of course, is the emphasis on drug interdiction and conviction. Many women are involved in drug use and also involved in the drug trade as mules, as people who will hold the stash for the men in their lives. And so that focus on prosecution, conviction, and incarceration for drug crimes definitely fueled an increase in that population. I also think that it is an unintended consequence of the women's movement, that the idea that women should claim their autonomy, the belief that women are as strong as men, means that the sort of the discount that female offenders would receive earlier in my career, because they were mothers and because they were women, was something that increasingly was disregarded by the courts, who said, listen, if you're, we're not going to treat you like you are somehow sort of too frail and fragile to be held accountable for your crime. So I think that was also the case. And finally, social disintegration. I mean, the fact is that the sort of structures that supported families and women have begun to fall apart or loosen in any event. And I think that's another factor that has led to increasing incarceration for our female offenders. As to the second question, white-collar offenders, I admit to a certain amount of cynicism about our criminal justice system as it affects white-collar offenders. It seems to me that the thinking is inverted when somebody who doesn't have the advantages and privileges that allow them to commit crimes cleanly and instead resort to street crime pay a much steeper price for the fact that they couldn't get their hands on the money through embezzlement or through fraud. They had to resort to theft, burglary, robbery, whatever. And I don't know why we shouldn't take the position that from those to whom much is given, much is expected. And if you have lived this life of privilege, and you have access to this kind of wealth and riches, you should pay, I think, a very steep price. I believe the correctional system should be ruthlessly egalitarian.
Thank you. Anyone else? More questions, please?
Can I say a word?
Oh, please.
So I agree with everything A.T. said about women. I'm now in white-collar enforcement, so I have to say anything I say is not the opinion of the Federal Entry Regulatory Commission. These are entirely my own opinions. There has been a shift. White-collar criminals are now being sentenced to much more severe sentences than they were in the past. I think that's a positive shift. I think in the past, there was a sense of no one was hurt physically, and we're not afraid of them. So much of the criminal justice system is driven by who scares us. Guy in the suit doesn't really scare us. Second, there's been the inherent bias from the judges who were doing sentencing before mandatory minimums, and a reason that there was a push for sentencing guidelines. Well, that person looks like me, wears a suit, went to the same school. I kind of have an empathy for that person in a way I can't for the kid from the inner city who talks differently than me and has an attitude, or appears to. And third, and this is my current position, these cases are hard to prove. They take years to develop. Juries have a hard time understanding complex financial fraud cases, and there is a urge to plead these cases out. Or in fact, for example, the head of SAC, Stephen Cohen, right, was never charged, even though everyone's pretty convinced that he committed a pretty massive insider trading fraud. It's just too hard to get the evidence. If you shoot somebody, it's kind of a trail. So I agree with you in principle. I think there are both improper motivations for treating it more lightly, and also some pragmatic ones as well.
Carolyn, if I may, I sometimes wonder what a movie made by Spike Lee about the criminal justice system would look like. That is to say, some white guy is arrested and goes to court. The judge is black, the attorneys are all black, the jury is all black. How is that white guy going to feel?
That's a good point. Who was next?
Okay, first I want to say thank you very much. This is very interesting. My question would be: are there any programs that you guys would think that are either implemented now or could be implemented that would seriously reduce the risk of or the rate of recidivism?
Scott?
There isn't a magic bullet. I think identifying people's barriers and trying to work through those barriers to reduce the likelihood that they reoffend is our best course of action. It's just such a wide array of reasons why somebody offends and reoffends that you have to almost make it individualistic to that offender. That's where I come from on the ground floor. I'm working directly with offenders. I know my fellow panelists take a more broader view of it, but it's identification, assessment, and behavior modification.
Thanks. Sir?
Well, I'd like to thank you guys for being here tonight. And I'm fortunate enough to work with juvenile offenders for the last 18 years and also get to work at the federal prison 1 day a week. I've come to my belief is sort of that like the top 15% of incarcerated people will probably do real well when they get out. And the bottom 15 or so are going to walk out the door and probably get high or commit a crime within the first 48 hours. But the majority of the people in the middle probably are well-intentioned, like he was saying, and want to do well when they get out of prison. I guess my concern is this. I read in the paper either today or yesterday that one thing is we can't seem to find an office for probationers and parolees to go to in Providence. That they want to put them in downtown Providence, but the majority of people, a few people want to put them in like a leper colony, it looks like, and put them in the worst part of town. We can't have people on probation or parole come into downtown Providence. So there's been this ongoing fight about where we're going to put them. And the other article I read was about trying to put a federal halfway house in Providence and the opposition to that. And I also, I received a call today from a woman whose husband is in federal prison and is a friend of mine. And, what's going to happen when he comes out? He's going to have to go to Boston somewhere or Bridgeport, Connecticut, because we don't even have a federal halfway house for Rhode Islanders. And I guess my question is when are we going to stop the stigma of people coming out of prison that every single person that walks out, or every person who's on probation or parole, is a bad, evil threat to society. But the reality is that most of them are probably going to do well and want to do well. But if we keep telling them we don't want them anywhere near our neighborhood, we want to just put them right back in the worst section of town, they can't walk through downtown Providence, you know, what is the message we're sending to these people?
AG?
Peter, I agree with you. Of course, our department, like Scott, is responsible for the supervision of those people in the community. What I say to folks is that, as I said, with 1 out of every 21 men under our supervision on any given day, probationers, parolees, ex-offenders are everywhere, and that if we were to paint them orange, the public would be astonished. Who's standing next to me in line at the grocery store? Who's filling my gas tank? Who's at the movies with me? Whose kid is on the same team as my kid? People have this idea that these folks are sort of the other, when in fact they are moving around us and living with us all the time anyway.
Joe?
I'll echo the thanks from several of our audience members already. These were fascinating presentations. Thank you for coming here to give them. It sounds from a lot of the remarks and from some of the work that Carolyn has done that we have a real cultural problem, which is that, as you mentioned, Director Wall, I think fear and anger tend to predominate in the public's thinking about these issues, and when there's a political advantage to be gained, it always seems to work in one direction, which is toughness. And that can only, if there's a political advantage there, it can only be because that's how Americans feel, and there's a real cultural tendency to push in that direction. So I'm wondering, all three of you, maybe some of you are involved in advocacy and some not, but in your experience, in your careers in this area, have you heard leaders making a public case, people making an effective case to public audiences about why we should handle things differently, why we should implement more programs that are likely to help people stay out of prison once they come out, that we should reduce incarceration rates and so forth? So I'm wondering about whether there's an opportunity for our culture to shift, and if so, whether there's anybody telling the stories or making the case in a way that can help shift perspectives.
I haven't seen it. Politicians need to be elected, and usually they don't get elected through being soft on crime, and that's unfortunate. I would love to see. I mean, I know in academia, it's a great discussion, and you can look at it in many different ways. But in reality, the general public, I don't think is they want the, how should I put it, to protect their children, and they think by protecting their children is to send people away, and that's how they're going to be protected.
So I'm in Washington right now, and I have to say it has been extremely heartening to see the Attorney General Holder, and his deputy chief come out in support of the Smarter on Crime statute, which is going to reduce some drug sentences and give some retroactive relief to people who were sentenced under the 100-to-1 crack powder ratio that punished crack cocaine offenders 100 times worse than powder cocaine, even though you need a microwave and baking powder to make crack out of powder cocaine. But more interesting than that, some of the groups, advocacy groups I've worked with, have forged a really interesting alliance between, the criminal justice reform groups are, criminal defense lawyers, families at the far end left of sort of American politics have formed an interesting alliance with libertarian groups who recognize that over-incarceration is another example of government overreaching, and also with groups on the Christian right who truly recognize and believe in redemption, that people are worthy of chances. And I have seen some real sort of linkages forming and coalitions forming that are making it safer for politicians and for people like Eric Holder and President Obama to finally use his commutation power. And although I'm not a starry-eyed anything anymore, I do think we've turned a corner and things will be better over the next few years because of those alliances and because of a recognition among our most conservative members of society, for example, on the federal bench, who just think this is gone. They're the ones who have to sit there and sentence these people and are truly troubled by sending nonviolent offenders to jail for life.
If I could just make one quick comment. I also think it's the sensationalized crime that is problematic, that has us take two steps backwards sometimes. It's that offense that somebody, the general public, finds so disturbing that there's an outcry for harsher punishments. Even though that may be a 1 in a million situation, it's viewed upon as encompassing all aspects of that particular crime. And that, I think, sometimes, we're taking steps forward, but all it takes is that one sensationalized crime to take 2 steps back.
That carjacking here a few years ago is
Exactly.
the best example, I
Right.
think. Yeah.
Sir?
Yeah, I just wanted to continue with the thought about where the reform can come from. There was an article in the Globe a couple of years ago talking about the reform measures that were taken in Texas by some very conservative politicians there, and their reasoning was that we're killing ourselves economically by this incarceration. I guess my other question or comment, I guess, is that both AT and David, you said, that corrections in the criminal justice system is kind of the who you're going to call, the default option. And is that appropriate? Do we think that is, in light of even what happened up at Bridgewater and came to light last year? And the people say the correction officers say, we're not able to manage mental illness. That's not yet that's what they do. Thank you.
What we in corrections feel is that we are we're the place that you have to go when no one else will take you. We have an ironclad no refusal policy. We can never say no when someone is sent in our direction. And as a result, we are a catch basin for an awful lot of, a whole assortment of behaviors that were not addressed by the other systems that have discretion when we don't. And it's very difficult for our staff. And staff will openly admit, he doesn't belong here. We don't know what to do with her. Because we operate on a rational model. We're managing large groups of people. Everything is, the rules. We assume that you know the rules, you understand the rules, you will follow the rules. If you don't follow the rules, you know there will be consequences. When someone is seriously drug dependent or floridly mentally ill or developmentally disabled, the rational model doesn't work. And so it's very difficult for them and for us. And yet, society doesn't seem to have found a place to put those people short of the end of the line.
Sorry.
Hi.
Hi, right there.
Referring back to rehabilitation, do you think that education, whether it be high school or college, should be a part of the rehabilitation process?
I do. There are certain states in which inmates are mandated to enroll in educational programs. And I do think that education is a very important tool for expanding horizons, gaining self-confidence, equipping people with skills. I will say that, 20% we administer the same tests to our inmate population as the schools in Rhode Island administer to assess your level of functionality. And the fact is that 1 out of every 5 inmates in our system tests at below 3rd grade levels. That is a setup for lifelong failure.
Thank you. So we can get some more questions in.
My question's for Mr. Wall, and I was wondering what are some significant changes you have seen take place in your department since you started in 2000, such as rehabilitation programs, and what kinds, and have they been successful?
I think we have seized an opportunity to rapidly expand our programmatic offerings both inside the facilities and post-release. When I say we've seized an opportunity, it's because the concept of prisoner reentry and effective reintegration have sort of taken hold, and that's given us a way to make our case and get. It's always hard to get funding for programs in corrections. Frankly, we're very expensive, and that's just the basics. I mean, staff, physical plant, basic health care, food, locks, fences. It costs $55,000 a year to incarcerate somebody in our system. And when we go to the legislature and say, we'd really like some programs as well because we think that we could affect the outcomes, they say, look, you're not politically popular. I don't say it this way, but that's the message. You're not politically popular. We would much rather spend our money on health, on transportation, on education for the larger members of the public. We're already giving you plenty. You really need to find your money for programs elsewhere. And what we've done is turn to our partners in the human service agencies and kind of stake a claim on them, saying the people we call inmates and offenders, you're calling clients and consumers. They're the very same people. They've just walked through a different door.
Who is? Yeah.
Yeah, a public defender I'm familiar with claims that perhaps 70 to 80% of all crimes have at their basis drug-related. So I'm talking about dealing, possession, but the crimes against people, the crimes against property. And it's his belief that if we decriminalize a lot of the drug laws, if we treat it as a medical problem instead of a criminal problem, it would have a drastic change on both the prison population and the recidivism rate. Any comments?
I will say that when I started the profession, the model that we had was the criminal mind, sort of the antisocial personality, and there's still plenty of that. But increasingly what we find is that we are managing public health problems like drug dependence and mental illness, and that 70% of our offender population is dependent on either drugs or alcohol or both. No question in our minds that there's a real correlation between that and the criminal patterns.
It's a little nuanced for me. I do support decriminalization for many drugs. I think a lot of violent crime is spawned by the fact that when you make something illegal, you create illegal markets. Illegal markets self-police with violence. So that's one of the worst consequences. Prohibition, of course, is the best example. It gave us organized crime in America. On the other hand, I'm nervous about decriminalizing some of the harder drugs because people, I mean, I grew up in New York City. So many people I knew used a variety of drugs, but most of the people I knew were college bound, and so they cabined it. When you introduce addictive drugs into communities that have low economic opportunity, poor parental supervision because parents are either working or incarcerated, you can accelerate addiction and dependence. And so I just think decriminalization alone can actually, in the short term, exacerbate some of the problems in the inner city. How we fix that is not to criminalize more. I just want to be cautious about that alone being a solution.
His other comment, I'm sorry I'm not using the mic, his other comment is that a lot of these people are multi-generational criminals. So the father is a criminal, the grandfather is a criminal, and there is no specifically no role model that hasn't been in prison. Therefore, it's sort of like, well, you and I went to college, they went to jail.
Mm-hmm. Crime is normal in a lot of areas. It's the norm. It's
Other
not
than Wall Street?
And you see it firsthand, Scott.
Yeah.
Have you ever had multi-generational?
Absolutely.
Like
Oh,
a
it's
father,
incredible.
son, daughter,
Sister,
father,
father. you know, and they all have the same names too. And you hear the name and you say, "Wait, did I have you on probation before?" "Oh, no, it was your father I had on probation."
You're junior.
But it especially in Fall River, there are areas of Fall River that are pretty bad areas that crime is normal. Antisocial behaviors are normal. So breaking through that is incredibly difficult.
I'd like to get a couple more questions in, please. Who has, oh, okay, but this gentleman, sorry, and then I will get up to you. Sir.
So as a lifelong liberal, I've always thought that crime was basically a function of the economy. That, you know, when the economy didn't work for you, then the criminal thing would go in, and all the, you know, the sort of other corollaries of economics, so family breakdown. So if you don't have a guy in the house, it's because he can't get a job. But anyway, we've been through a terrible recession. Crime is going down. I mean, all the indicators that I would have thought, family structure, the economy, that kind of thing, even the high imprisonment rate, which then breeds crime in the sort of crime school that you may run, Director. So am I wrong, you know, that the economy underlies, you know, a lot of this, and yet it just goes down, 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 and it hasn't, you know, it's a question.
I have a few thoughts. So it's not a simple answer. Let me bang off a few points. A lot is related to generational issues. When you have certain explosions of population, you know, of young males, you know, 15 to 25, you're going to see more crime. Drug epidemics have a lot to do with it. So when you have a surge in particular kinds of drug use, like methamphetamine is still causing a lot of crime in certain rural and western communities. We have smarter policing now in some of the bigger cities where they're using computer modeling and smarter sort of attacking areas where there's crime. That's helped, I think, a bit. But I also think that you can't ignore personality. And I'm kidding about Wall Street, but I'm dealing now with commodities traders, many of whom I think are criminals. They have very high risk tolerance. They have fairly low regard for the rules, right? And they're willing to take risks, and they're willing to disregard the rules because they want to make a lot of money. And I've seen this in the inner city as well. I've seen lots of kids who did fine, who found their way out. And then you had other kids who are like, I'm not going to go work at McDonald's for minimum wage. I'd rather be on the street selling crack because I can have the lifestyle I see on TV. And that, I won't call it a criminal mind or antisocial personality. I'm simply talking about risk preferences and risk tolerance that put two people in the same situation, and one will follow the rules of the trading floor and the other will engage in a market manipulation. You're always going to have crime. But I do think you're right in a large macro sense. The economy has a lot to do with it, but economic opportunity, even more than the general economy, I think has a lot to do with it. When people have hope, see their peers or their parents doing well, it helps them stay on the harder, slower path to success.
But we've just been through this period where it's just the opposite.
I don't profess to know why I'm as baffled as you are by the fact that crime rates are going down. I think David's identified certain issues. It was pointed out to me by a professor at the University of Cincinnati, in fact, that in this recession we've had a surge in unemployment, all kinds of people in economic distress. He said, but not all these unemployed people are going out and committing crimes. Your circumstances have to be linked to a certain set of beliefs and attitudes, antisocial beliefs and attitudes. You know, as in the only way to get ahead is to cheat, lie, and steal, or the reason, you know, or that person was victimized because they deserved it. That seems to be the link.
And not so forget about age. My sister's in her 50s. She was unemployed for 2.5 years, and I don't believe she committed any crimes in that period. in part because she had family support, and in part, once you cross the 35-year-old threshold, your recidivism goes down regardless of what we do. This recession affected older workers in a way that previous recessions have not. They tend to sit on park benches and not commit drug crimes or rob grocery stores.
I was going to echo that, is that I think economic ebbs and flows are different in the inner cities and in the high criminogenic areas. The rate of unemployment rate in Fall River is astronomical. It's absolutely incredible. Crime has remained relatively the same. With the ups and the downs of the general economy, Fall River has stayed the same. So I think that the economy within areas may play a little bit of a role, but it's the job opportunities. I don't think there have ever been job opportunities in inner cities, good job opportunities. And I think that's always led to criminal behavior, regardless of the general economic ebbs and flows.
Yes.
My question is for Mr. Zlotnick. You said that you spent some time in prisons meditating with prisoners and that you saw they were people who needed support and compassion, and I was wondering if you thought that there would be any way to get that message out to the public, or if the concept of fear and anger is something that will rule the way we treat prisoners from now on.
Sure. So the Prison Mindfulness Institute, you should look them up. They're based in Rhode Island. They do some really great public outreach. The founder of the group spent 14 years in prison himself for drug crime and is a great spokesman for this issue. The press does a much better job at covering the front end, the sensationalized crime, the bad, horrible crime, but I do try to get reporters interested. I got the Huffington Post to do 2 stories on Scott Walker, this fellow I've been working on, including a kind of day in the life, talking about the 1,000 books that he's read, the songs he's written, the things that he's done, and anyone who has any contact with journalists needs to encourage what we normally call human interest stories to be written about released inmates. One of the most profound stories I've read is one of the people that Clinton pardoned at the end of his term. Serena Nunn went on to University of Michigan Law School and graduated. And she was what we call a girlfriend case. She got involved with the wrong guy, clearly understood what he was doing and helped him a little, and ended up with a 15-year sentence that was commuted after she served about 8 or 9 years. And what a success she's had. And she's gotten a lot of coverage for her accomplishments and her dignity, and just the way she carries herself. She's an incredible spokesperson for released inmates.
That's great. We've run a bit over, but let's have another question, please.
This question is also for Mr. Zlotnick. I know you've talked about how violent crimes are a big problem and how the criminalization of things causes illegal markets. And I was wondering, how do you think increased gun control would affect incarceration rates?
All right, so I don't have a problem with guns, with people hunting, shooting. The problem is when angry, stupid, drunken people have guns, easy access to guns. So I think that putting guns in places where people can only use them for the right reasons would significantly cut down on gun violence and cut down on the homicide rate. So I think that would be a good thing. There's not a lot of fan for that position across this country. Overall crime rates, probably less, but some of the worst crime, I think, the sort of violent gun deaths we saw in D.C. during the crack epidemic would not have occurred but for the easy access to guns in Virginia, which were then just carried over the line. I don't know how the rest of either feel.
Do you mind if we move on? Just this gentleman's been very patient.
Thank you. In places like Germany, like Scandinavia, the federal budget covers the school costs. In the United States, school costs are covered by local taxes. And I lived in a town in Connecticut which was very well-to-do, had great schools. My children went to Ivy League schools and all of that, graduating from there. We're very proud of that. across a little river that was hardly 50 yards across. You cross into the next town, which is 40% non-white. In every house you have 6, 7 kids, 2 families living to a house. The tax base is very, very low, and the schools are a disaster. How can we expect, with such a system, to reach a point where we don't breed criminals?
We can't.
I agree with you, and I also accept the fact that the very reason that well-to-do people often reside in places where there are good public schools is because they're willing to pay the prices for the housing because they can have their kids in those kinds of schools. And any attempt to equalize that formula across the state would probably be met with massive opposition from the people whose children do enjoy the advantages of their parents' wealth through good, free public education.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you. We ran a bit long, so thank you to all of you as well for staying and for your questions and comments.
And thank you to you, Carolyn, for your moderation, and to all of you. I mean, who doesn't like to be asked their opinion? So our thanks to you.